bad-mouthing of poorly designed sites and apps. If you enjoy people poking fun at things with obvious flaws, you're reading the wrong book. Designing, building, and maintaining a great website or app isn't easy. It's like golf, a handful of ways to get the ball in the hole, a million ways not to. Anyone who gets it even half right has my admiration. As a result, you'll find that the examples I use tend to be from excellent products with minor flaws. I think you can learn more from looking at good designs than bad ones. Now with mobile. One of the dilemmas I faced when updating this book was that it's always been a book about designing usable websites. Even though the principles apply to the design of anything people have to interact with, including things like election ballots and voting booths, and even PowerPoint presentations. Its focus was clearly on web design, and all the examples were from websites. Until recently, that's what most people were working on. But now there are a lot of people designing mobile apps, and even the people working on websites have to create versions of them that work well on mobile devices. I know they're very interested in how all of this applies to them. So I did 3 things. Included mobile examples wherever it made sense, added a new chapter about some mobile-specific usability issues. One last thing, before we begin, one crucial thing, really my definition of usability. You'll find a lot of different definitions of usability, often breaking it down into attributes like useful, does it do something people need done? Learnable, can people figure out how to use it? Memorable, do they have to relearn it each time they use it? Effective, does it get the job done? Efficient, does it do it with a reasonable amount of time and effort? Desirable, do people want it? And recently, even delightful, is using it enjoyable, or even fun? They'll talk about these later. But to me, the important part of the definition is pretty simple. If something is usable, whether it's a website, a remote control, or a revolving door, it means that a person of average or even below average ability and experience can figure out how to use the thing to accomplish something without it being more trouble than it's worth. Take my word for it, it's really that simple. I hope this book will help you build better products, and if it lets you skip a few of the endless arguments about design, maybe even get home in time for dinner once in a while. Krug's first law of usability. Michael, why are the drapes open? Kay Corleone in The Godfather, Part 2. People often ask me, what's the most important thing I should do if I want to make sure my site or app is easy to use? The answer is simple. It's not. Nothing important should ever be more than 2 clicks away, or speak the user's language, or be consistent. It's don't make me think. For as long I can remember, I've been telling people that this is my first law of usability. It's the overriding principle, ultimate tiebreaker when deciding whether a design works or it doesn't. If you have room in your head for only one usability rule, make this the one. For instance, it means that as far as is humanly possible, when I look at a web page, it should be self-evident, obvious, self-explanatory. I should be able to get it what it is and how to use it without expending any effort thinking about it. Just how self-evident are we talking about? Well, self-evident enough, for instance, that your next-door neighbor, who has no interest in the subject of your site and who barely knows how to use the back button, could look at your home page and say, oh, it's a. With any luck, shall say, oh, it's a. Great. But that's another subject. Think of it this way. When I'm looking at a page that doesn't make me think, all the thought balloons over my head say things like, okay, there's the, and that's a, and there's the thing that I want. But when I'm looking at a page that makes me think, all the thought balloons over my head have question marks in them. Thinking. Typical culprits are cute or clever names, marketing-induced names, company-specific names, and unfamiliar technical names. For instance, suppose a friend tells me that XYZ Corp is looking to hire someone with my exact qualifications, so I head off to their website. As I scan the page for something to click, the name they've chosen for their job listings section makes a difference. Note that these things are always on a continuum somewhere between obvious to everybody and truly obscure, and there are always trade-offs involved. For instance, jobs may sound too undignified for XYZ Corp. Or they may be locked into job or armor because of some complicated internal politics or because that's what it's always been called in their company newsletter. My main point is that the trade-offs should usually be skewed further in the direction of obvious than we think. 1. There's almost always a plausible rationale and a good, if misguided, intention behind every usability flaw. Another needless source of question marks over people's heads is links and buttons that aren't obviously clickable. As a user, I should never have to devote a millisecond of thought to whether things are clickable or not. The time like deciding what to click on. And as a rule, people don't like to puzzle over how to do things. They enjoy puzzles in their place. When they want to be entertained or diverted or challenged, but not when they are trying to find out what time their dry cleaner closes. The fact that the people who built the site didn't care enough to make things obvious and easy can erode our confidence in the site and the organization behind it. Another example from a common task: booking a flight. Granted, most of this mental chatter takes place in a fraction of a second, but you can see that it's a pretty noisy process, with a lot of question marks. And then there's a puzzling error at the end. Another site just takes what I type and gives me choices that make sense, so it's hard to go wrong. No question marks. No mental chatter. And no errors. I could list dozens of things that users shouldn't spend their time thinking about, like where am I? Where should I begin? Where did they put? What are the most important things on this page? Why did they call it that? Is that an ad or part of the site? But the last thing you need is another checklist to add to your stack of design checklists. The most important thing you can do is to understand the basic principle of eliminating question marks. When you do, you'll begin to notice all the things that make you think in the sites and apps you use. And eventually you'll learn to recognize and avoid them in the things you're building. You can't make everything self-evident. Your goal should be for each page or screen to be self-evident, so that just by looking at it, the average takes a little thought to get it, but only a little. The appearance of things like size, color, and layout, their well-chosen names, and the small amounts of carefully crafted text should all work together to create a sense of nearly effortless understanding. Here's the rule: if you can't make something self-evident, you at least need to make it self-explanatory. Why is all of this so important? Oddly enough, not for the reason people usually cite. It's true that there's a lot of competition out there, especially in things like mobile apps, where there are often many readily available and equally attractive alternatives. And the cost of changing horses is usually negligible, 99 cents or even free. But it's not always true that people are fickle. For instance, they may have no choice but to stick with it, if it's their only option, for example, a company intranet, or their bank's mobile app, or the only site that sells the rattan they're looking for. You'd be surprised at how long some people will tough it out on sites that frustrate them, often blaming themselves and not the site. There's also the "I've waited 10 minutes for this bus already, so I may as well hang in a little longer" phenomenon. Besides, who's to say that the competition will be any less frustrating? So why, then, making every page or screen self-evident is like having good lighting in a store. It just makes everything seem better. Using a site that doesn't make us think about unimportant things feels effortless, whereas puzzling over things that don't matter to us tends to sap our energy and enthusiasm and time. But as you'll see in the next chapter when we examine how we really use the web, the main reason why it's important not to make me think is that most people are going to spend far less time looking at the pages we design than we'd like to imagine. As a result, if web pages are going to be effective, they have to work most of their magic at a glance. And the best way to do this is to create pages that are self-evident, or at least self-explanatory. Scanning, satisficing, and muddling through. Why are things always in the last place you look for them? Because you stop looking when you find them. Children's riddle. In all the time I've spent watching people use the web, the thing that has struck me most is the difference between how we think people use websites and how they actually use them. When we're creating sites, we act as though people are going to pore over each page, reading all of our carefully crafted text, figuring out how we've organized things, and weighing their options before deciding which link to click. What they actually do most of the time, if we're lucky, is glance at each new page, scan some of the text, and click on the first link that catches their interest or vaguely resembles the thing they're looking for. There are almost always large parts of the page that they don't even look at. We're thinking great literature, or at least product brochure, while the user's reality is much closer to billboard going by at 60 miles an hour. As you might imagine, it's a little more complicated than this, and it depends on the kind of page, what the user is trying to do, how much of a hurry she's in, and so on. But this simplistic view is much closer to reality than most of us imagine. Fact of life 1. We don't read pages. We scan them. One of the very few well-documented facts about web use is that people tend to spend very little time reading most web pages. Instead, we scan or skim them, looking for words or phrases that catch our eye. The exception, of course, is pages that contain documents like news stories, reports, or product descriptions, where people will revert to reading, but even then, they're often alternating between reading and scanning. Why do we scan? We're usually on a mission. Most web use involves trying to get something done, and usually done quickly. As a result, web users tend to act like sharks. They have to keep moving, or feel die. We just don't have the time to read any more than necessary. We know we don't need to read everything. On most pages, we're really only interested in a fraction of what's on the page. We're just looking for the bits that match our interests or the task at hand, and the rest of it is irrelevant. Scanning is how we find the relevant bits. We're good at it. It's a basic skill. When you learn to read, you also learn to scan. We've been scanning newspapers, magazines, and books. So if you're under 25, probably Reddit, Tumblr, or Facebook. Allow our lives to find the parts we're interested in, and we know that it works. The net effect is a lot like Gary Larson's classic Far Side cartoon about the difference between what we say to dogs and what they hear. In the cartoon, the dog named Ginger appears to be listening intently as her owner gives her a serious talking to about staying out of the garbage. But from the dog's point of view, all he's saying is blah blah Ginger, blah 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 Ginger, blah blah blah. What we see when we look at a page depends on what we have in mind, and it's usually just a fraction of what's there. Like Ginger, we tend to focus on words and phrases that seem to match the task at hand or be our current or ongoing personal interests. And of course, see the trigger words that are hardwired into our nervous systems, like free, sale, and sex, and our own name. Fact of life 2. We don't make optimal choices. We satisfy. When we're designing pages, we tend to assume that users will scan the page, consider all of the available options, and choose the best one. In reality, though, most of the time we don't choose the best option, we choose the first reasonable option. A strategy known as satisficing. 1. As soon as we find a link that seems like it might lead to what we're looking for, there's a very good chance that we'll click it. One economist, Herbert Simon, coined the term a cross between satisfying and sufficing in Models of Man, Social and Rational. Wiley, 1957. I'd observed this behavior for years, but its significance wasn't really clear to me until I read Gary Klein's book Sources of Power: How People Make Decisions. Klein spent many years studying naturalistic decision-making. How people like firefighters, pilots, chess masters, and nuclear power plant operators make high-stakes decisions in real situations with time pressure, vague goals, limited information, and changing conditions. Klein's team of observers went into their first study of field commanders at fire scenes with the generally accepted model of rational decision-making. Faced with a problem, a person gathers information, identifies the possible solutions, and chooses the best one. They started with the hypothesis that because of the high stakes and extreme time pressure, fire captains would be able to compare only 2 options, an assumption they thought was conservative. As it turned out, the fire commanders didn't compare any options. They took the first reasonable plan that came to mind and did a quick mental test for possible problems. If they didn't find any, they had their plan of action. So why don't web users look for the best choice? We're usually in a hurry. And as Klein points out, optimizing is hard, and it takes a long time. Satisficing is more efficient. There's not much of a penalty for guessing wrong. Unlike firefighting, the penalty for guessing wrong on a website is usually only a click or 2 of the back button, making satisficing an effective strategy. Back is the most used button in web browsers. Weighing options may not improve our chances. On poorly designed sites, putting effort into making the best choice doesn't really help. You're usually just as well off going with your first guess and using the back button if it doesn't work out. Fact of life 3.